Welcome, everyone. I'm here with the members of Assai Ad Libitum, and we are going to talk about their performance and the music that they're bringing to us at this year's Bloomington Early Music Festival. So welcome, Patricia, Sophie, and Ryan. Could you introduce each of yourselves and tell us a little bit about your ensemble?
My name is Sophie Genevieve Lowe, and I play the violin.
I'm Ryan Lowe. I'm originally from Wales, and we're now based in Virginia, and I play the cello.
And my name is Patricia García Gil, and I play the fortepiano. This ensemble was born from our love for historical performance and playing together and collaborating, and especially for finding composers and musical works that are a little bit overlooked. So the theme of this year, Blooming Early Music Festival, was perfect for us. We found a lot of inspiration in the topic, and we decided to put together a program.
Wonderful. And how did you sort of come upon your program as sort of focusing on the revolutionary Napoleonic eras and exiles from France?
I think for both us, or both sides of it, we were sort of doing independent research that was kind of along those lines. Both Patricia and I write for Early Music America, their writing series about composers in America. So we were already thinking about, so as Patricia said, these kind of early composers. And then obviously in the colonial time period, there was a lot of influx of French influence. And then of our unique combination of fortepiano, cello, and violin, that also kind of squarely puts us in a certain time range. So it sort of just naturally started to flow together as we were exchanging ideas and composers. Pretty soon we realized, oh, we're very interested in the music of during the French Revolution.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say the same thing. I was going to say it was really funny because we were thinking about it separately, and then we had a call and we were like, I have an idea. I don't know if it would work. And I was thinking about the French Revolution, and I think she told me that, and I'm like, oh my God, me too. So it was clear that we were gonna focus on that.
Yeah. And were there some of the performers or some of the composers, the musicians who are part of your program that you had encountered before or performed any of their music on other occasions?
The first piece of the program by Hugh Deforge, we first came upon that doing research for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. So although there's some overlap and there's also some areas that don't, but in Colonial Williamsburg, there is an interest in the French Revolution naturally, and the interplay there between American and French relations. So there was some overlap, but the rest of the program was completely new to Sophie and I.
Oh, for me, actually, I was familiar with the Chevalier de Saint George. Obviously, as a violinist, I encountered him when I was first in high school, and I always found his life very, very fascinating. So I was glad to get to incorporate his music again, but on my side, he was the only other. Everyone else was new.
And for me, it was Hélène de Montgeroult, the one that I had already played, and I had been interested in her life and music from a while ago. My specialization is in women composers from the 18th century. So obviously she's a figure that has been rediscovered, and her music is so interesting, so ahead of her time. She has like this suite of etudes that is like, some of them seem like Chopin, written by Chopin, and it's like incredible because she was born in 1764. And then, well, the rest of her life is also even more amazing. Like she was saved from being executed by playing the Marseillaise, so it's almost like a film. And then she was also part of the first the first professor during the foundation of a Paris conservatory in 1795. And she was teaching men, which is something that then eventually didn't happen for a while. So at the very beginning, they had like maybe like more like an open mind, or she was so special that the committee of teaching inspectors that were founding the conservatory chose her. And actually, that was part of the reason why she was saved from the guillotine. So, I mean, I've been always like very fascinated about her and her music, and I wanted to play this sonata with violin accompaniment that I hadn't had the chance of playing before.
Yeah, it's a really astonishing story, which we have several of course, among the different composers whose music you've chosen for your program. Patricia, you mentioning all of those fascinating etudes. I think about how the Paris Conservatory or the Conservatoire was really the first sort of institution where etudes are being written at all. So Hélène Montgerot really is sort of on the forefront of that part of music that is such a big part of every young musician's life, and even everyone once they're at the age that giving all sorts of public performances with the concert performance of etudes that happen now. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the other composers who are on your program? We've had the mention of Montgerot, Hudeforge, and Saint-Georges. Could you say a little bit about Méhul?
Yeah, Etienne Méhul is by all means a very serious composer. He's not a household name today, unfortunately, but a 20-year-old Hector Berlioz said he would rather be Méhul, although he's dead, than a Berlioz in his prime. He wrote this to his father. And in our program, we have this light gavotte by Méhul, which kind of reminds me of his comic operas. And I think what it does is it balances the program and shows kind of France in this time period. However, the gavotte probably doesn't represent Méhul. Like I said, he was a very serious composer. He wanted to write serious works, and he was kind of under this pressure to basically follow Parisian fashion at the time. So his friends were always like, write another comic opera, but he wanted to write serious works. In 1797, his symphony has these kind of Haydn-like qualities to it. And by 1810, he was dying, basically. He knew he had a terminal diagnosis. And again, he committed himself to writing what he would call serious works. But again, he was distracted by that, by his friends' constant pressure to write more and more comic operas. So in our program, we have the kind of light, playful Méhul, but perhaps not the real Méhul. He deserves to be a household name if you look through his works, his operas, his symphonies, his overtures. So very excited to hopefully help the public rediscover Méhul.
Yes, for sure. I'm talking about, I am familiar with him from some of his operas, from their performances, a few of which were very popular in other parts of Europe. But I think so much of the music from both chamber music as well as operas from composers like these are not really well known to audiences today. Although there are a few people who are bringing performances and recordings out, which is really exciting. Probably the most famous composer on your program, that some folks may know from there's the 2022 biographical film about him, is Joseph Bouillon, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who, Sophie, you mentioned a little bit already. Could you say a little bit more about your relationship with his music and your ideas about him and his life, which is really a remarkable story that probably deserves to have a lot more movies made about it.
Yes, I completely agree with you. So many of the composers in our program, as Patricia said, it just sounds like almost just a drama, the life that they lived. But Chevalier de Saint-Georges, his father was a French nobleman. His mother was a Creole slave, and he just lived this very life that was just juxtaposed between this elite French society and then being held back just lamentably because of the color of his skin. He had this relationship where Marie Antoinette was very fond of him, and he was in that court. But then at the same time, they wanted to appoint him as leader of the Paris Opera, but then people in the opera said, no, we can't have him. This would be degrading to us. And so he wasn't able to get that position. He went to play with Gossek's orchestra and was able to lead that. So did have some success in that. And then when the French Revolution took place, he was always kind of in this in-between where, although he was friendly with the royal family, he very much supported the ideas of the revolution. And was in support of that, and then was thrown into jail in 1793, actually the same year that Pleyel was arrested as well. And so he had this very sort of this life that was really disillusioned, where he was fighting for these things, and it would just been so interesting if he'd had the chance to really mature in a way where his music was supported, because he wrote so many fabulous pieces. These sonatas, his concertos, violin concertos are fabulous. So I'm glad that he is becoming more of a household name. But he's just as a violinist, he's very, very fascinating to play. He was known as being one of the best swordsmen in Europe. And as a violinist, I feel like I can feel that in the way he just gives some of the bow, and you feel a little bit like you're fencing yourself. But just a very, fascinating person, and seeing just with our theme, this music in exile. He was definitely in exile because of the French Revolution, and then as we said, just lamentably because of the color of his skin. So he was someone his life was very much affected by the French Revolution, but at the same time we were able to see these very beautiful pieces that came out. A lot of his pieces that he wrote, you do see these influence of this of him looking back to his upbringing, especially in our second movement of sonata. In this minor section, we tried to bring this sort of influence that he had in his music. So he was a very fun composer for us, I think, all to play and just to really think about elements of his life to bring into his music and his interpretation of his sonata.
That's it's really fascinating, all of the different things he was both able to accomplish and all of the different difficulties that he was forced to overcome. And you mentioned he has some fascinating and beautiful concertos. I've also run across his symphonie concertante, which are, of course, this odd genre that's sort of halfway between a symphony and a concerto, but which was so popular with Parisian audiences in the 18th century. Ryan, could you tell us a little bit about Hu de Forge?
Yeah, and he's been an interesting composer for us, partly because he was also an able cellist, and that always gets the cellist excited, especially in the duet setting in this time period. Just the cellist has much more to do, the bass lines usually just much more interesting. So he's been an interesting composer to work with. It's part of really this whole, what we found with this whole program is that although Hu de Forge is slightly later, for example, when I was in Music Conservatoire, one of the dissertations was talking about Mendelssohn and the start of the Romantic time period. But when we were working on this program, we're really in the 1790s talking about the Romantic time period, and in the Forge we see it really is just almost fully romantic, like so many of the other works. I don't know if you also wanted to explain with.
Yes, he's kind of an interesting character, because some of the composers that we have, you can see very, very distinctly how the French Revolution impacted them. With de Forge, it was a little bit more putting in the dots. So he was a trumpeter in the cavalry. and he lost his finger in 1792, and then he kind of changed his career a little bit, and he was French nobility, and then he ultimately went to Russia. There's a lot that's not known about his life, his early life, but obviously with the imperial court in Russia speaking French, it's easy to see kind of why there would be an appeal to go to a place that was a little bit more stable. He did, after the Battle of Waterloo, he did come back to France. So he seemed to be very much monitoring just kind of this situation in France. But he's as Ryan said, his duets are very, very interesting to play, and just very full of this sort of almost romantic sort of feelings and bowings. But he's been a fun composer for us, especially to explore as a duet.
As you're talking about some of these different composers and their lives and their music, I mean, you mentioned there how this this Who de Forge duet feels so romantic, despite the fact that it's much earlier than people maybe think about that. I mean, if we sort of consider this period of, say, the 1790s through the 1810s or 20s, something like that, this is really the era that most audience members are going to associate with, say, the Viennese classicism of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and your concert and the music that you've chosen, and all of these individuals whose music you've chosen really turn our focus somewhere else, right? And remind us that there's a whole lot more going on at the time than maybe most audience members are thinking about. And beyond just bringing this music that it will be new to folks, exposing listeners to new music, how do you think that your concert here can really help expand their understanding of this time, and maybe even those composers who they're more familiar with?
Well, I think that including these overlooked composers is necessary to complete the picture of history that otherwise would be untruthful. Because yes, of course, we have Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, and they're great, and we love them, and we want to keep playing them, of course. But there was a wider variety of things going on in Europe at the same time. And I think that looking at history through the lenses of individuals, such as the ones in our program, gives us a richer perspective, because it opens our eyes to the mainstream practices of a time and place, instead of just to some particular individuals. So yeah, I think these works are testimonies that are primary sources for understanding the 18th century practices, including the preferences about interpretation and instruments. And for example, in our program, that we are including different kind of genres in a way, because we have the duet, we have the accompanied sonata, we have a sonata that has the cello obbligato, but one that has that we have incorporated the cello, because why not? We think that maybe at the time they were playing at home, and they were like playing with, being the keyboard the main instrument, because this is a time where the keyboard takes over the harpsichord for real at the end of the 18th century, and it becomes like the favorite instrument for performances, especially at home at the time. And as well, very related to women who would host these salons, like, for example, Montaigu did, and they would be able to play on their own these musical pieces, but also with other people. And that is why the accompanied sonata that we've chosen, for example, the Montaigu one, with a violin accompaniment, that we've put cello, as I was saying, and that is the reason also why we think that could have been possible. Like, the lady of the house could have played on her own, but also with a violinist. And why not? What if there was a cellist at the party? Then they would have been able to play together. So we think that exploring all these different composers that are not so common yet. And all this also like variety in the musical styles and genres, it's very, very like eye-opening for understanding and having a richer picture of what's going on in the late 18th century in Europe, and in this case, particularly in France. But since these composers went to other places, there was an exchange between cultures in the different places in Europe.
Thank you. Sophie or Ryan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think Patricia said it very, very well. And I think it's just, as she said, it's just kind of exploring these different genres and where people would be performing, music with the Chaplet de Saint George. He was working with Gossic's orchestra, and he was having it in more of these public big performances. The Montague, we also have, like she said, these very private sort of concerts. So even our concert is exploring the different spaces that music was happening as well. And we hope that does complete the whole picture of just what the musical sphere was happening during that time period.
Yeah, I've touched on this. Just my observation from this program is that I believe I've observed the public perception of Romanticism is that like there's late Beethoven and suddenly it explodes out of nowhere. And I don't know if anyone else shares in this observation. It's just a personal observation, right? Late Beethoven, and suddenly Romanticism, like I said, out of thin air, nothing. But in this program, we see that's just not the case. 30 or more years before that, we have composers that are solidly in the Romantic time period in the 18th century. So it's like the more we research every day, our perception of our musical timeline is shifting significantly.
Yes. Well, and talking about that shift, by taking our focus away from these composers who we're all so familiar with and looking to a place like Paris, where there's so much music being written and performed, but that hasn't made it into the canon of the 21st century. It can show us things like, oh yes, there's people doing this kind of composing, this kind of making this kind of music decades earlier than we may realize. And it really, again, changes the way that we think about it and brings us some new perspectives. Patricia, you mentioned a little bit in your comment a moment ago that, I mean, one of the kinds of pieces that you have on your program are these accompanied sonatas, but they're not necessarily accompanied in the way that we might be used to, right? Where we say, oh, it's a violin sonata where you have a violin and a piano accompaniment. It is a piano sonata with a violin accompaniment or a cello accompaniment. And like you were saying, that we have, if you have a piano at home, you could have this entertaining yourself or entertaining friends and family in a salon, maybe the lady of the house playing her piano sonata. And if somebody happens to be around who plays one of these other instruments, you can add them on. And so we get this very, a really different interpretation of what this kind of piece is from what we're used to. Are there any other maybe interesting genre or musical things that you would maybe want to highlight for audience members, things for them to listen for, or just interesting curiosities?
Well, I think the accompanied sonata is such a fascinating genre that is a little bit unexplored as well. And as you were saying, it brings out something different from the sonata itself, because, well, I think it's like the beginning of the rise of chamber music as instrumental music, because in this century, we see the rise of secular music as well. And I think it's totally related, the fact that more people can play instruments and then they find ways of playing together. Maybe in this case, the piano being the central one, just because it was in every home by, well, this is maybe a little later, by mid 19th century, but it starts in the late 18th century. And just because, you know, it's an instrument where you can play everything together if you want to, but also if you have the chance of playing with others, you can also use it, because with the dynamic possibilities, you can totally, you know, take on different roles by accompanying or being the soloist. You can definitely adjust, and it is probably easier to play with other people than with an instrument such as a harpsichord, which has standard sounds. And of course, it can adapt, and being the basso continuo was its main function for a reason. But the piano offered these different possibilities. So for us, what I can say is that it's been a lot of fun to find different possibilities in these little dialogues and conversations that happen when the piano sonata get other instruments. And in the case of the Montgeroult one, where we particularly added the cello, and maybe Ryan can expand on this, it was a lot of fun to decide exactly what to play there, depending on what I was playing, what the violin was playing, but also on the effect that we wanted to bring out. And I think he will be able to say it so much better than me, but it's so fun to explore and to almost like improvise. And same with improvisation, now that I'm saying it, the way that the accompanied part is written quite vaguely. So the piano part is. So it accepts a lot of improvisation, ornamentation, and we've tried to do that. And when you do it on your own, it is fun. But when you do it with others, then it becomes a real conversation. And then this also like enhances the inherent connection between text and music in the 18th century. So it's a way of talking, it's like a speech, and we are having this conversation together as a group. But yeah, but I'll let them talk, because Ryan was the one who had to add more to the written part.
Yeah, the Montgeroult was the most fun because we had this opportunity to be historically informed, yet also creative and improvise at the same time. So it's, you know, it's kind of like this whole holistic kind of musical adventure together. And as Patricia shared, we were really trying to just capture the reality of chamber music in the home at a time period where, of course, if you had a friend with a cello, they wouldn't just sit there and say, well, I'll get a cup of tea. And then when you're done with that one, I'll come in. You know, you'd play along, right? You'd pluck along, you try to make something work. And so that was just an exciting experiment for us. And yeah, with the cello in this program, we see a great diversity. We see the Montgeroult where there isn't technically a cello part. We see in the Bologna, there's certainly a cello in mind in this kind of continuo kind of a more classical style. It certainly fits on the cello. He certainly had it in mind, although it works without cello as well. And then we have the Pleyel trio where it actually has a cello part, which is nice for me. But so yeah, we kind of see this whole, you know, broad range really of different ways the cello is getting involved in this time period.
Just sort of, you know, following up some more on that, are there other things that you think are really interesting, again, for folks to listen for, maybe in those pieces, thinking about the different relationships between each of you as performers? Were there maybe some really fun moments in some of the pieces that you'd like to highlight?
I think for me, as I alluded before, the second movement of the Bologna was really fun when we did. He writes this piece that in some ways it's quite plain. He was obviously expecting that there to be ornamentation and interpretation, and so we went through several versions before we kind of found the one that we did, which we had a lot of fun playing and kind of improvising around the different parts, but definitely involved a lot of creativity because, as I kind of said, without it, it is a bit plain. Of course, he had that on mind, there to be that space for the performer to bring something. But for me personally, that was kind of the most fun one to explore and to change, especially since we went through so many different versions before we found one that we felt as a group just really expressed what we wanted to. And then also really just kind of captured Bologna's life as well in his music.
The Gavotte by Mahul is the first full recording of that piece and the only historical recording of that piece ever done. So just that's kind of part of the reason of this group, is that that's part of the interest for the audience, is that many of these works have never been recorded or recorded in full. So that's just something to listen out for. Listen, because you might not get a chance to hear it again.
Speaking of these pieces that have no recordings, or that people will have never run across before, were there other pieces or other composers, other musicians who you ran across in your research that you are hoping you can do more with in the future, or maybe pieces that didn't quite fit this setting or that sort of thing, that you're excited to keep exploring with this theme?
There was one composer named Jean Edelman who actually was Mahul's teacher. And he wrote a lot of really fascinating music and the violin sonata. And he was actually sent to the guillotine for being, against the state. And it was a horribly sad story where he was sentenced and executed on the same day. But he wrote a lot of very fascinating music. And so I hope that he's someone that we can, as we're getting more and more interested in this particular genre and time period, that we can also explore, because his music is also very, very fabulous. And I had never run across him before, but he was actually quite a prolific composer. But that's kind of this whole program, is so many of these composers, you do wonder, do we not know them so much today because of the French Revolution, and because, like, his life was tragically cut short and the government didn't want his story to be remembered. So it is just a very fascinating topic, because through our research, there's many composers, we looked at or that were very interesting, didn't quite fit what we were doing, but it's been a very fascinating process, but especially the Jean Edelman, for me, I thought was someone that I hope that we can explore in the future.
Patricia or Ryan, anyone else that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, for sure. So the accompanied genre sonata is so interesting to me lately. And there are many other sonatas written by women. Again, I think because especially them were the ones who wanted to play by themselves, but also with friends. So there is this other French composer, Julia Mélie-Candaille, who lived also during the French Revolution. I think she was more towards the side of a revolution. A very interesting character. She was an actress as well. And she has a lot of, or a couple of these accompanied sonatas that I would love to play. And then moving to other countries, in Vienna as well is a genre that is practiced. And for example, I'm thinking now of Josephine Auernhammer, who wrote as well accompanied sonatas. And oh my God, her music is so virtuosic. It's like literally very difficult. And I love it because it's it shows like how the display of virtuosity between women was getting also more accepted and normalized. So yeah, for example, just two examples of what I would like to keep exploring.
And I mean, I think I'm talking about these women who are writing this music. And maybe this is another really great way to explore some of these women composers who also haven't been recognized as much, in part perhaps not just because of their gender, but because of the writing this music that doesn't quite align with expectations, but there's so much of it, and like you're saying, so much of it is fantastic. And I know that there are I've run across women writing accompanied sonatas in Britain too, of course, since all this music is happening everywhere. So lots of exciting possibilities for your future performances. I think we can move towards wrapping up here. I just maybe like to ask if you have some of your final thoughts about your program, about the festival, or thinking about this idea of musicians in exile, and the way that music connects them, or to their home, to their ideas, to other people, and maybe how that can how we can think about that today.
I think we were just very first grateful that we had this opportunity to explore this topic, and we've all learned so much in the process. And I think with the music in exile, it is interesting because they were all, why they composed and how they were affected was very different for each, composer. For example, with Cleo, our trio that we played, he wrote it because France dissolved, his position, and so he went to London and he wrote these trios. Or Dvorak going to Russia, or just all these composers were affected in different ways, but at the same time, that musical exile, it drove their composition. And so it's interesting to hear how that played out in their composition. And then just I think it's important just to note that during, especially sort of the reign of terror in the French Revolution, the government was very much saying that instrumental music without words was banned. You had to have music that was holding patriotic values and sort of those things. So even just that the compositions of those pieces were very much, they were not meant to really be happening. And so it's very interesting, just like I said, just to that sort of play and how that comes into the music. And I think for the audience members, just as they're listening to it, just think about the extreme amount of stress that all the composer must have been feeling, but they still had this immense artistic output. So it's a very sort of strange thing of this reign of terror on one hand, and then this absolutely gorgeous music that's happening, which I think a lot of times arts is a response to in the midst of horrible things. So it's a very interesting, I think, place for as performers to be in mentally, but I hope also the audience can think about that as well as they're listening to the music.
With that, let me thank you, members of Assai Ad Libitum, Patricia, Sophie, Ryan. Thank you for having this conversation with me today, and introducing this music and these composers to the audience. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful time listening to your performance.
Thank you.